Okay, hi everyone. I guess we can start now. Thank you for coming. I'm really excited to have this conversation with Raika. And the reason why we decided to invite her is because she's amazing, and also because it's wrong to talk about Iran and the war that Israel had with Iran and consider how it affects us, how it affects them, without bringing the Iranian perspectives and hearing their voices. And I hope that Raika can share this today. And this is the last webinar from the series that we hosted. We need to find it out. Надо разобраться. It was a series of webinars during the war when we were trying to figure out what the hell was going on. Okay, and I'm passing the mic to Raika. The floor is yours. Thank you so much for being with us and everyone for coming. And Pavel for translating.
Thank you all. It's really wonderful to have this cross movement solidarity and learning from each other. My name is Raika. I use they, she pronouns. I've got some slides I'm going to go through, which I will share in a moment, but I wanted to just give a bit of context about myself because I think it's important sometimes when you don't know a lot about a country to sort of just take one person's opinion, and you shouldn't. So this is, I'm going to give you as much fact as I can, but some of this will be, through my lens and through my life experience. And the thing about being Iranian is that we all have a very different life experience, and we're not a monolith. So my background is that my parents left Iran when the revolution happened, where the regime took over because they didn't support the regime. And as a result, I've never been to Iran. So I was raised in an Iranian household. I speak Persian, but because of the safety risk, I've never been there. And particularly since my activism, for those of you that are aware of the Woman Life Freedom Movement since 2022, which I'll cover in a moment, it's really not safe for me to go. So I can't see that I would be able to set foot on Iranian soil until this regime is out of power. But that's the context. So my paid work is that I'm a climate campaigner, communicator. I do the activism for a free Iran just because it's my heritage. I'm not a politician. I'm not a researcher. So, I will give you kind of like a broad brush lens of what's happened in Iran today and what the impact of the war with Israel has been so far. But that's with then an invitation to jump off and explore more in other places as well. So let me just do that embarrassing thing where I try to share my screen and hope it just works well. Good. I think that's working.
Yeah, all good.
Just going to do the full screen. Yes. Are we good? Are we full screen? Yay.
Yes.
It's always a relief when you get that done. Okay. So I'm going to go through, there's a lot of text on these slides, don't worry. It's more actually for me than for you, but also I wanted to give you a visual of how long protest has been happening in Iran for. I wanted to give context for the history of protests in Iran before we go on to the war with Israel, because I think that Iran's internal issues are actually quite badly covered in the media. And there's a lot of propaganda that's swallowed by particularly Western media. So it's really important to understand that actually there are decades of protest that have been going on in Iran against the regime. So the backdrop of all of this is that Western imperialism has very much been a thing for a long time, meddling and influencing since the 1950s and probably earlier than that. Now, sometimes in the current context, that's a little bit overplayed and the harms of the regime are underplayed, which kind of is all part of the propaganda piece. Whereas I would say the two things sit next to each other, and actually Western imperialism hurts us as much as the Islamic Republic and the regime. But, the people of Iran on the ground are mostly concerned with their day-to-day under the brutal regime that they're living under. So just then to give context of what happened, so in 1979, there was a revolution, the Islamic Revolution, which was caused by a range of factors which resulted in this very brutal regime coming into power. The factors were that people were not happy with the Shah. He wasn't necessarily an entirely benevolent leader. He was not, he didn't look after marginalized identities. There was oppression and execution of marginalized identities in Iran. And there was also a little bit of a feeling that the Shah was a puppet of the West. So there was a lot of different things and different factors that I won't go into lots of detail on. But that resulted in basically multiple different groups coming together from the left across to the regime that's in power now to have a revolution. And unfortunately, the groups on the left thought that they would get more control, more of a seat at the table than they ended up getting. And, a lot of them have now said that they wish they hadn't participated in that revolution. So that's then when the Islamic Republic came into power and started, all of their different things, including mandatory hijab, stripping away women's rights, and continued and extended harm of marginalized identities. So then on International Women's Day in 1979, there was a huge protest of largely women, 100,000 people who went to protest the fact that this regime was in power, protesting mandatory hijab and women's rights. Hundreds were injured. We don't know how many were killed. There probably were some that were killed. And then you go forward into 1999 and you'll see that the next kind of couple of sets of protests are reformist protests. So what that means is that they're hoping that they can reform the regime rather than get rid of it. So these are student-led, and they're calling for things like separation of mosque and state, free press and gender equality. A lot of the protests in Iran is led by students. This is tens of thousands of people, 20 plus killed and 2,000 detained in Iran's prisons. 2001 to 2003, again, more reformist protests. This time they're calling for an expansion of civil liberties and free press. There are general strikes that are going on. And again, more killing. So thousands of people attended, over 100 killed, 4,000 detained. And then we're moving into a slightly different realm with the Green Movement. So in 2009, things started to change, where protests broke out initially calling for reform, and then fundamentally switched to regime change and calling for a democracy. And this was after an election where the reformist candidate actually lost. So if you're not aware, elections in Iran are not legitimate, they're rigged. So this began as a reformist protest and moved into actually, we need regime changed. So millions of people participated in this, hundreds were killed, and thousands were detained. And then in 2016, there was a stronger move away from this reformist approach and more to actually really looking at dismantling the regime and restoring Iran's pre-Islamic and pre-Islamic Republic history. So again, tens of thousands attended this and hundreds were detained. I don't know the numbers on killings, if there were any. And then we continue forward. So you'll see that the pace of the protesting, we're talking about pretty much every year now. We're moving to economic protests in 2017-18. People are calling for regime change and also the end of the terror proxies, because what the Islamic Republic was beginning to do was to funnel the money that belonged to the Iranian people out into its proxies. So I don't know if many of you are aware, but actually 70% of Iranians live below the poverty line today. And that's partially because of mismanagement of funds for the regime, but also because they actively send the money out to their proxies. And there are some iconic images of women removing their hijabs as a part of that protest. So 40,000 attended, several thousand detained, and some killed. And then we've got the Bloody November protests in 2019, only a year later. This was sparked by 300% gas price hike. So again, more economic reasons, calling for the regime change. Hundreds of thousands attended, thousands killed, thousands detained. And I believe this is the first time, obviously because of the year that it was in, that the regime actually used the tool of oppression to turn the internet access off, because they didn't want Iranians to be getting news of what they were doing out to the rest of the world. Then in 2020, there was a Ukrainian airline flight that the Islamic Republic shot down, and it had civilians from lots of different countries, but dozens of Iranians on it. Again, a call for regime change, and this was spread across multiple university campuses, and lots of people were joined, more were detained. Then we moved to water shortage protests. So as I said, there's a lot of mismanagement that the regime does because it doesn't really care about the country or its people. So a combination of the climate crisis and also mismanagement led to severe droughts and devastated agricultural communities. So again, lots of protest around that. And then it sparked up again, and probably the one that people these days know the most well is the Woman Life Freedom movement, which was sparked by, in 2022, which was sparked by Gina Amini's murder. You may have seen pictures of her wearing a hijab. She was murdered for wearing, well, she was arrested and detained by the regime for wearing inappropriate hijab, even though she was wearing a hijab, but it wasn't to the standard that they wanted. Also, she was Kurdish, so that's a marginalized identity. They would have been specifically targeting her for that. And she died under their custody. They beat her up. So this caused a massive revolution or a protest in 2022, again, calling for the end to the Islamic Republic, a secular democracy. And that's the biggest protest since the 2008 ones. Hundreds of thousands attended, and I think we're talking, last time I remember, like over 15,000 people were detained. And then today, or from 2024 ongoing, there's been, lots of different protests. So there was a presidential election that most of the country boycotted because they're sham elections anyway, so hardly anyone turned out. And miraculously, the candidate that the regime wanted to win won. A refusal of hijab, so you might see in footage that's not generated by the regime in Iran. There's a lot of women walking around not wearing hijab. And there's been some sort of attention from EU lawmakers trying to progress things. There's human rights activists trying to end gender apartheid in Iran. But right now, today, there are lots of people protesting in Iran because of electricity shortages and water shortages. Again, this is part of maybe some of the impact of the war, but also just the mismanagement of the regime and the lack of care it has towards its people. So the bottom line is decades of protest against the regime, and it continues to brutally oppress Iranians with the implicit backing of the West, because the West continues to do deals with them, continues to do hostage deals with them. And the regime has also misused the Free Palestine movement to strengthen its propaganda machine, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail in a moment. So that's kind of, a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the history of protests in Iran. Now, one thing I want to sort of stress here, because people often say, why don't the people just rise up and take over? And there's a couple of reasons. One is that the West keeps strengthening the regime by doing deals with them, giving them money, legitimizing them. But the other is that unfortunately there is no agreed upon opposition. So there are opposition groups coming from minority groups, from the Kurdish groups, from the Baluch groups, political dissidents. The prisons are full of political dissidents, diaspora. Even we don't have agreed opinions, and other religious groups. So the reality is we're very fractured. We're not united on a way forward. There are people that would prefer Reza Pahlavi, a monarchist. There are others that absolutely don't want that. So while freedom is the shared goal, there is not yet an opposition bringing groups together. And that's what happened in 1979. The reason that was successful is that they managed to bring multiple groups together to succeed with that revolution. So despite desperately wanting and needing freedom, the people are not yet united on a way forward. So to come on to the war with Israel, and to sort of ask the question, how did Iranians in and out of Iran feel about the war with Israel as it was happening? The important thing to note is that the government in Iran used the same mechanism to shut down the internet and they also were monitoring calls, so people and messages. So people, if they wanted to get messages out to family, if they weren't using encryption or particular apps to protect it, they were being monitored by the regime. So there was difficulty getting out information for us to even know exactly what was going on. They weren't, they were being monitored and limited in their communication. But there was no monolithic response. You'll see that I keep saying this a lot about Iran. There are lots of different opinions and feelings. There's a huge amount of trauma from the regime that results in different positions. But I've kind of summarized some thoughts on the different views. So, some folks in and out of diaspora, in Iran and in diaspora, were hopeful, hoping that maybe this is finally going to be it. Maybe Israel is going to take out the regime and we will be able to revolt and have freedom. And that shows you how oppressed they are, but that's how some of them were feeling. Fearful. So for those of us in diaspora, worrying about people we know in Iran, if they were safe, and obviously people in Iran being worried about their own safety, but then fearful psychologically of the continuation of Iranian suffering. So the opposite of the hopeful, this isn't going to be it, it's not going to work out, it's not going to go the way that we need it to, and Iranians will suffer. And then there was also like ambivalence or indifference, where it's like, well, we're so oppressed, we've been so not thought about for so many decades, so forgotten about, nobody ever supports us anyway, this will be exactly the same. And then a different kind of indifference, which I heard from some people in Iran, where because they live below the poverty line, because they themselves feel that their lives in Iran are not actually worth living, some of them, life is difficult, that whether or not they were harmed in this war made no difference to them. So a huge range of different views and positions on it, and you can see how trauma plays a big part in this, that you would actually be supportive of your country being attacked by an external country because you want to come out from oppression. But obviously there were also folks that absolutely did not want that to happen, and a lot of people that were a lot of Iranians, especially in diaspora and in Iran, were against war. We don't want war in Iran. Sorry. I want to play some of the reality of what's then happened. So that was how we feel, but this is the actual reality of what's happened kind of since the war, and a part of everything that's been happening since October 7th. I just want to play you a video. This is a white American who clearly has been paid by the regime to go to Iran and talk about a little bit of propaganda. So I just want to play this.
I don't hear any sound of it, should be there. Do people hear the sound of the video?
No. Can you hear it or no?
No, there's no sound. There is a typical problem with Zoom demonstration. I guess we need to
Don't worry,
like
we can
look
share
a
the
bit.
link for that. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's fine. I can give you the overview of what is happening. So basically she's being paid for clearly a propaganda tour, and she's talking about the Islamic Republic as the resistance for a free Palestine. And she uses the term, I think it's like indigenously made drones. That doesn't even make any sense to me. Like what does that mean? But the point is that one of the realities for us is that the Islamic Republic appears to support the Palestinian cause. Now, to be very, very clear, I'm an activist for collective liberation. I support a free Palestine and I want all people in the region and the world to be free and safe. But they misuse that movement and use it to further their propaganda. So they have, you know, since the war, during the war, been paying Western influencers to go out there and do propaganda for them, to do state sponsors tours and praise the government as an act of resistance. But the reality is that you know, it makes it sound like the regime is reasonable. It makes it sound like they actually behave like a state that would come in to rescue other people. The Islamic Prophet doesn't behave like a state. It behaves like a crusade. You know, its whole thing is rooted in ideological warfare, martyrdom, and trying to, you know, kind of export its revolution and its ideology beyond its own borders as well, which is one of the reasons that it funds terror proxies and tries to radicalize people in other countries. So I can share the link for that video later, but if you have a look online, sadly, you will find a few different videos like that. And then to talk about kind of, you know, not just the emotional impact of the war, but what was the actual reality of it. So obviously in Iran, there were hundreds of deaths and injuries. We can't really trust info from the regime as to how many there were, but there certainly were, you know, deaths and injuries. But the other impacts that it's important to note is that while they were at war with an external country, they were continuing their war with their people, against their people. They did not stop the oppression of their people. They did not support people to get to shelter. They did not protect anybody. They were not interested in that because the regime isn't. So the reality of it is that during the war with Israel, 2,000 people were arrested by the regime. For examples of that are like teenagers being arrested for social media posts about the war. They particularly targeted their execution rate. So for those that don't know, Iran executes people, I think it's one of the highest executions per capita in the world. And it just ramped that up during the war because it could do it under the guise of, they took the internet down again. And they started executing marginalized identities, particularly Kurdish political prisoners, at a much faster rate. And they actually used the war to do that because they were charging those people with espionage for spying on behalf of Israel, which, you know, they almost certainly were not doing. They also, because Evin prison, which is the main prison that they house political prisoners in, it was bombed. They moved them, but they actually used that as an excuse to disappear some of them. So some of our political prisoners, we now don't know which prisons they're in. Some of them, we know which prisons they're in, and they're in much worse conditions. And to be very, very clear, to be in prison in Iran is not a pleasant experience. You are physically assaulted, more than likely sexually assaulted, and awaiting execution if you're on death row. So being taken to a worse prison is really saying something. But some of them have just been disappeared. So some of these people are our political leaders. These are the people that we want to come out to be a part of building what will come after this regime, and they are disappearing them and harming them and executing them. They've also, you know, there is this propaganda in the West that they are in support of a free Palestine, because they, you know, are there backing them. But the reality is they don't support anybody, because if they were pro-liberation and collective liberation, they wouldn't also be deporting thousands of people from Afghanistan. So we've got lots of refugees from Afghanistan in Iran. They've deported hundreds of thousands of them back to face the Taliban. So this is not a regime that is interested in collective liberation, and they've done that during this war. They also, because as I mentioned, they make money. One of their ways of making money is through hostage deals. They arrested a German tourist in Iran on charges of espionage for Israel for filming, which again is almost certainly not going to be accurate. They do this quite a lot. Every now and then they arrest non-Iranians because they know they can get money, or they can exchange hostages, or they can do some sort of deal. Another thing that isn't kind of listed on this site is that, you know, when the war happened, like the people in Iran were already under 70% of them were already living below the poverty line, so the economic situation was already bad. But then they couldn't get their money out of banks, or there was limits on that. Inflation went up. And since the war, there have been huge electricity and water shortages in Iran, which, you know, the regime might be blaming a little bit on the war, but, you know, a lot of that is to do with their own incompetence and their lack of care for their own people. So people in Iran are now having to actually go and purchase water from dispensers. And I saw it's a small thing maybe compared to other things that are going on in the world, but I saw a video of a man who sells ice cream with his little ice cream truck. His ice cream's all melting. He can't sell it because there's no electricity. So, you know, and that's the folks that are able to do that. There are people who literally can't feed themselves because they live below the poverty line. So this is actually the reality of what's happened, you know, since and during the war in Iran. I also wanted to touch a little bit on climate and fossil fuels because I'm a climate campaigner, and just to understand Iran's position there. So Iran has about 9% of the world's oil. It's fourth in the world for oil reserves and second in the world for natural gas reserves. So it's a fossil fuel state. And at the moment, it sells its oil, although I know there's been some changes around that. It sells its oil to China and Russia legally. But it also navigates because there's sanctions against the sales of Iran's oil. That's one of the things that the West, you know, does to try to keep them under control. But they kind of navigate that by actually sending unmarked tankers into the sea, and then they're sold at sea, and then they're relabeled as not Iranian oil. So there's probably more Iranian oil out there than we're aware of. The bottom line is that brutal fossil fuel regimes maintain power partially through our global dependence on fossil fuels. So they wouldn't be able to oppress their own people. They wouldn't be able to send as much money to proxies if they weren't benefiting from fossil fuels. Now, the other sad thing about this is that Iran is actually very well positioned to do solar. They would do great if they actually expanded into solar, but they're not investing in that. So even as a minimum, if we were to globally focus on homegrown renewables and a reduction of consumption, it would afford the regime less power. It might also push them towards solar options because there wouldn't be demand for their fossil fuels, which would help the people of Iran. Because right now, that government is doing not a single thing to protect against climate breakdown, and Iran will be on the front line of climate breakdown as it hits. Another thing on this is that the Strait of Hormuz is like a kind of shipping route that oil moves through, and Iran actually has control of that area. So countries should be really worried about the fact that you know, Iran can cause a lot of volatility by just shutting that down. The war with Israel caused that to halt, but also, you know, the Islamic Republic, I should say, could also, you know, cause problems for the movement of oil. So that's another reason to move to renewables ASAP. And then another obvious one, the emissions cost of all war. You know, we know that the emissions cost of the genocide in Gaza and the bombings is just horrific. It's astronomical, and it only brings us closer to climate collapse. Our current trajectory is that we will be at unlivable temperatures and conditions, that says without, but it should say within our children's lifetimes. And within the region of Southwest Asia and North Africa, or otherwise known as the Middle East, that area will be top of the list to be unlivable locations. It will be too hot, there'll be too much extreme weather, there'll be drought. So, you know, as a fossil fuel state, it will also not survive the climate crisis. It'll be an unlivable area. So I just wanted to give some of my thoughts of kind of what all of this means for me, my activism, my organizing, and kind of bringing it all together, is that instead of seeing kind of some of this kind of propaganda getting wrapped up into the Free Palestine movement, which I fully support, But we are seeing, you know, IRGC, so the Islamic Republic flags, and photos of the supreme leader of Iran, who is a mass murderer, at Free Palestine protests. And I'm actively trying to combat and educate people on that. I want to sort of not see that. I also want to not see a free Iran movement that undermines minority rights. You know, we've got issues with not being supportive of Kurdish rights, of Baluch rights, and also because of our trauma, sometimes conflating Palestinians with Hamas, because, you know, the Islamic Republic sends money to Hamas. And I also don't want to see, you know, a Western leftist social justice domain that glorifies the Islamic Republic and practices a racism of low expectation by saying, oh, well, because you're brown, you can't do bad things, which isn't true. You know, as Iranians, we very much are an oppressed people by, you know, supposedly our own people. Instead of all of that, I'd like to see, and I'm hoping that conversations like this will continue to develop this, active solidarity across all peoples in the region and in our diasporas against the authoritarian, murderous and oppressive regimes that many of us live under. And to know that we are for each other if we can just work out how to be. And that I really believe that the connective tissue between our struggles is how we will win. So knowing that the Islamic Republic oppresses its people under the guise of liberation for others, knowing that you know, the government of Israel is acting against the views of progressive Israelis, the fact that, you know, Hamas is doing things that Gazans aren't happy with, that we're all living under oppression, that Israel is attacking Gaza and Palestinians. Like, there's so much oppression, there's so much authoritarianism, there's so much horror, mostly actually being executed and delivered by men, by patriarchs. And if we can figure out that connective tissue between our struggles, that actually our fights for liberation are the same and not be pitted against each other, then that's how I believe that we will win. So, you know, these are just some of my ending thoughts. I won't read them all, on just the things that I hope and feel that we will be able to achieve, so that we can free everybody in the region. And, you know, as an Iranian, I guess to call and encourage for people to remember that despite the fact that there's a lot going on in the region, that Iranians are oppressed by their own government and trying to get free from them. So I'm going to stop the share now. And that's kind of everything that I was going to share, and had to say I'm sorry that the video didn't work on the sound, but hopefully you got the gist of what I was going to offer with that. So I'm happy to open it up to any questions, any clarifications, or just hand it back to you, Masha, to pick up.
Yeah, thank you so much. So many things resonated with us. Many of us are from Russia, and now many of us reside in Israel. And it's painful how familiar many lines are. I do have questions, but I'll be happy to give people the space to ask first. Please raise your hands or write them in the chat in any language that works for you. Okay, I'll start. Well, I have specific questions, and I have the one that I think many people here would want to know the answer for. What do people in Iran think about Jews and Israelis? Like, it's a very big question, and you partially covered it, but maybe you have like an answer for how it looks in general, and whether it somehow changed with the war.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's important to note is there are a lot of Jewish Iranians. So like there's a whole contingent. Our peoples are very interconnected. So, you know, I know quite a few Jewish Iranians. I think that's such a challenging question to answer without repeating the thing about the not being a monolith. Because as I said, there are well, firstly, the important thing to actually note is that the Islamic Republic, so I'm talking about the regime, not the people, is ideologically against Jews and Israel. And that's where the fear from Israel comes into play and is then exploited by an authoritarian regime. So that's what the state's position is. Now, the people of Iran, there are, you know, they are oppressed in their own religious identity. So unless you are a Muslim, and in fact a specific type of Muslim, you're not allowed to practice your religion. You're not allowed to practice your identity. I come from a Zoroastrian background. That is an oppressed identity in Iran. So you know, folks are not allowed to practice their religions, whether they are Jewish or Christian or, you know, whatever else. But then I would say that there is a lot of support and solidarity for Jewish folks. And I would say some, personally, it's difficult for me to say this, but I think misguided solidarity for what Israel is doing because they see Israel as coming to stop the Islamic Republic from expanding its terror proxies and all of that. But then there are also Iranians who are, you know, very much in support of free Palestine, but also, like me, understand that Jewish people have a right to be safe and to exist. So it's really, it's not a straightforward thing to answer. You will see that depending on which political opposition to the regime is talking, you'll get a different position. So Reza Pahlavi, who is the son of the Shah, who is one of the people interested in the future of Iran, he has taken, you know, quite a pro-Israel stance in some respects. But if you look at some of the other political leaders from different groups, they've taken a very different position. So I would say it's very complicated and not easy to answer. There's a lot of trauma wrapped up in it. But what I am hopeful for, and what I have started to see, is more spaces like this where we're coming across different identities. I actually watched a beautiful video of a mix of Israeli, Palestinian, and Iranian activists, and they're starting to put more circles together of those identities together so that we can talk, not necessarily to solve the problem, because obviously it's been decades and decades, but to build those bridges. And actually, interestingly, watching a lot of those be led by women, which, considering the patriarchal regimes that we're under, is a really powerful statement. So I'm sorry it was a long answer. I don't have a straightforward one. It's complex, but I'm hopeful that there is a generation of people inside Iran and also in diaspora that is actually going, hold on, we keep going through the same trauma cycles. We keep repeating the same issues. We need to figure out how to find each other's humanity separate from the regimes and the authoritarianists and the patriarchs that are basically dictating to all of us how we live.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I think how do I phrase this? If we're out protesting or at marches and we see quite clear symbols that are supporting the Iranian regime, do you have resources or do you have suggestions of how to go about countering that, and maybe like a re-education component or a sort of a corrective approach to making sure that it's tackled when it's seen?
Thank you, Cam, for asking that. Yeah, it's really difficult. I think if it might be in the moment, in the middle of the march, the protest, that you can't actually address it because of what's going on. But if you can find out who that person is or was, what group they're from, and try to have an open dialogue. Because what I've found is that there are some groups that I can go, oh, hey, by the way, do you realize that you're actually oppressing Iranians when you do that? And then they go, oh, no, I had no idea. And they go off and do some research. And there's some groups that have been fed the propaganda so badly, and I won't name a name, but there's a group in the UK that I was talking to recently that they just started insulting me as an Iranian and told me I didn't know my own history, because, you know, yeah, they've just swallowed the propaganda. So I think you may be successful, you may not be successful, but finding out who it is and just asking them openly, like, do you know what this flag, how most Iranians feel about this flag? Because the flag of the Islamic Republic, most Iranians we feel sick when we see it because it's our oppressor. And obviously pictures of the supreme leader when he's actively, you know, advocating murdering our people is very traumatic. So just starting there and saying, do you realize what this actually means to Iranian people, that these symbols are oppressive the same way that there are, you know, symbols of oppression for Palestinian people. And so if you can kind of bring it back to a humanity, because I think that the challenge with it is, as I said, with the Western imperialism, there's this propaganda that is the Islamic Republic is standing against the Israel and the West in the region. And it's like, but they're also, well, firstly, they're doing that because it looks good. And they're doing that because it extends their power, but also they're oppressing their own people. So like, how do we hold everyone's liberation next to each other? And I think if you can say, but do you not also want Iranians to be free, as well as Palestinians, as well as Israelis, as well as everyone in the region? And then that's a good start. But it's not easy, and you might get some pushback. So just to warn you.
And just a quick follow-up. So, and have you come across anything that could be offered as an alternative resource or an alternative symbol or something? Because I imagine one way to sort of approach it is to say, you know, that idea of like, I'm not going to highlight a problem, but I can offer some sort of semblance of a solution.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's very difficult because if you I would just say if you want to use the words like no war with Iran or stop bombing Iran, that would be better than a flag symbol. So like a placard that says that is fine. And obviously symbols, you know, pictures of the supreme leader are an absolute no-no. Because obviously Iranians don't want to be bombed, like I covered. We don't want to be bombed. We don't want to be at war. We actually mostly just want to survive this regime and come out the other end of it and have food and water and, you know, live and have our families around us, and you know, not all our youth being murdered and executed. So it's kind of more just thinking, well, what are you actually asking for? You're not supporting the regime. You're trying to call for an end to war. You're trying to call for an end to bombing in Iran. And then I guess somehow trying to bring in the fact that the regime is not a positive thing. So I've sometimes done placards and things that say, you know, that list I put at the end, I actually saw someone wrote that all on a placard and took it to a protest. I was like, yes, we've not just got like one like non-nuanced statement, we've got like everything on a placard. But you know, versions of that basically. Sorry, very convoluted, not simple answers, but that's what you're going to get from an Iranian.
Thank you.
This is great. Yeah, we like not simple answers. I'm going to read the question that was asked in the chat. Question is from Jan, and he says, "Thank you for your story, for your talk. I have a specific question. I'm a head of an initiative that works with transgender people in Russia, and we have set up a shelter in Yerevan for people fleeing from Russia. We have started receiving applications from transgender Iranians fleeing from Iran to Armenia. We provide them with shelter as well, but we really need to collaborate with an Iranian LGBTQ organization or simply a human rights organization that could help them further with their route. We cannot help them with their further immigration route, as all our contacts are only with Russians. Perhaps you have some contacts with the Iranian organizations that you could introduce us to for further cooperation."
Yes. I have a network, so I can find out from my network. I am in touch with a number of different groups and people who've done this sorts of stuff before. So if maybe you give me the contact for the person who's asked this, I can reach out to them and go and take it to my network. It'd be good just to have that written so I can push it out to my network and see what I can do. One really interesting point to share about this is that, if you may or may not be aware, the approach to LGBTQ rights in Iran, obviously being queer in Iran is punishable by death. but they do something very odd, which is it looks like they support transgender rights, but they don't. What they do is kind of enforced, and I'm using this term very carefully, right, because it's not gender affirming. They enforce sex change because they want a binary. So if you are a lesbian and you are in love with a woman, they would encourage you towards a sex change so that you would be a man, and then that would be a binary thing. So that's just a really, like, I learned this a few years ago and was horrified about it. But yeah, that's kind of they've got a very kind of unusual, ideologically binary, messed up view on all of that. But you know, very much the queer and the trans community is not safe in Iran, is very marginalized, probably more likely to be below the poverty line, also to be not necessarily supported by their families because of all of that ideological push. So they're going to be more likely to be homeless and therefore at risk of lots of other things as well. So just to share a little bit of random further info. But yes, please reach out to me and I'll do what I can. I'll push it through the networks and see if we can find someone to help you.
And for help into international connections and solidarity. Does anyone else have a question? I have one more, but I'm also happy to give space. Okay, I'll ask. You've mentioned a few times during your presentation that you think that West should stop profiting from Iran, should stop think you can should stop giving money to Iran and supporting this regime. And as someone from Russia, like, we have also experienced sanctions from the West, and it was obvious that many of them target civilians and not only politicians. So, like, what do you think about that? Do you believe that the policy of isolating the country will actually lead to any good place? I mean, I think you believe it because you said it, but
yeah,
it's complicated.
Yeah. I know, yeah, that's it. It's complicated is the answer. So some Iranians have a very black and white, like no sanctions view, because of the fact that they're difficult. They're not always done with the people in mind. But if I was to give you my ideal answer, it would be very, very clear, specific sanctions on the regime. Because right now they are sending their family and their children to other countries to be educated. And those children, if they're girls or whatever else, they're not walking around wearing hijab. They're doing whatever they want. So they have assets and money and things in different places around the world. They have a level of freedom and that they don't afford their own people. So while I don't have the exact answer, I think that the regime itself and the members of it are not actually being limited enough in their ability. So when I talk about sanctions, I'm talking about very, very targeted, specific sanctions, rather than kind of economic sanctions on the country, because as I said, 70% of people are below the poverty line already. There's no money, there's no food, there's no access right now to water and electricity in a lot of parts of Iran. So I hope that clarifies. It's not kind of like these broad brush like economic sanctions that would help the people, but like more specific like sanctions on individuals and those associated with the regime. Because the thing is, there are people that are working for the regime and there's a class of people that are benefit from the regime. And those are the ones that need to feel the pain, not the everyday people who are just trying to, you know, get through their lives. So I'm not an expert on exactly what those sanctions would look like, but I do believe we can put more specific sanctions on those folks in a way that doesn't harm the population. Whether or not Western governments are capable of doing that in the appropriate way is another question, but that's still one of the things I think is ideally needed.
Okay, we have time for 1 or 2 short questions. Okay, Regina asks to recommend a trustworthy source of news or info regarding Iran.
So there's the Center of Human Rights for Iran. I'm just going to look up their exact name to make sure I'm getting it right. You can also trust like Amnesty Iran as well. And there's the Center for Human Rights in Iran, Amnesty Iran, and there's also Hengor, which is let me spell it, Hengaw, Hengor organization. That's a Kurdish news organization. And there'll be a couple more. I'm glad you're asking about trustworthy, because unfortunately, and what's one of the problems we have in the diaspora and in Iran ourselves is we have to figure out who is actually a regime affiliate and supporter and who isn't. So some of the outlets that are out there, they look like they're really kind of collective liberation-y, but actually if they cover the Middle East and they don't talk about the oppression of the people of Iran, that's a massive flag. Because it's just, it's ridiculous. So yeah, those are the ones I would suggest. Center for Human Rights in Iran, Amnesty, Hengor. There's also a campaign called End Gender Apartheid in Iran. And that, I think, is probably one of the most legitimate legal routes we could get to actually progressing and changing things in Iran, because ending gender apartheid is such a fundamental part of their ideology, that if there was a legal framework to push that through, if there's anything, that will be the thing that goes through. So I would recommend that. Also, just a human rights activist that I follow. Some of this stuff is kind of like you have to follow the right Instagram accounts, if that makes sense, because it's not all the mainstream stuff isn't always very good. But there's a human rights lawyer called Gizounia, Gissounia. I'll put her in the chat. She's a wonderful human rights lawyer who's associated with the End Gender Apartheid campaign, and that's across Iran and Afghanistan, that campaign.
Amazing, thank you. And we have the last question, which is, what are the current expectations, anticipations among Iranians regarding the development of further military events with Israel? A good note to finish with.
What do we think is going to happen? Oh gosh, I don't honestly know. I mean, the thing is, the problem with Iran and Israel is that multiple times over many years they've done these sort of dances or like symbolic attacks where they've started and then it's all died down. This has been kind of the worst it's gotten in some time. I would really just be speculating, I'm not really a political commentator in that regard. I'd be surprised if Iran initiated anything at this point, but I don't know. I wouldn't say the door is necessarily closed on that conflict. So yeah, I wish I had an answer for you. I don't know. We spend all of our lives just trying to guess what's going to happen the next day. So I'm honestly not sure. I think the biggest thing is people are actually dealing with how they feel after what's happened, because obviously the ones that were hopeful that this would mean the end to the regime, the reality is the regime has cracked down, has gotten more dangerous. So Iranians in Iran are more worried about just surviving the regime than anything else. But obviously there are mixed feelings around, well, thankfully the war is not happening right now and people are not currently being attacked. So I don't have a straightforward answer, but there's an underlying feeling for Iranians of just wishing that the rest of the world would understand the scale of the oppression that Iranians are under. And we're conditioned to expect to some degree for people to misunderstand us or to not understand the ramifications of things that happen and what they mean for us. So I think there's a lot of processing of that going on right now, and to some degree a little bit of like, oh, we don't know we don't know what's going to happen, and just hoping that our families and people are going to be safe. So sorry, I wish I could give you like an amazing analytical answer on that, but I haven't a clue, so I'm just going to be honest.
I wanted to use the last 3 minutes to ask one more question, if that's okay. What do you think should happen in Iran? Well, I don't know what government should be, what statement should be made for you to feel safe to go there?
Ooh, the Islamic Republic, and there's also another group, MEC, who are also just equally bad and a cult. Those two need to be completely out of power and are basically pretty much exiled from Iran, not exiled, but like very, you know, just not at all remotely in power. Because if there's even the tiniest chance of them having some sort of involvement in a government going forward, there's always that risk for me. I just wouldn't be able to feel safe. And to be honest with you, I'd probably have to wait a little while to see how stable that was and whether or not it was going to stick around, and also whether or not, because, you know, hopefully we wouldn't make the same mistake again, but we had the revolution in 1979 hoping for something better, and we created something worse. So, you know, I don't know. I would love to hope that in my lifetime that's something that will happen, but I don't know. I don't know if it will. And there's also the climate crisis and that worsening things in Iran, which is going to be adding, you know, fuel to the fire. So complete and utter regime change and a united front from multiple groups in Iran, where we understand marginalized identities like Kurdish, Baloch, you know, refugees from Afghanistan, and we don't just focus on, because I'm from the Persian like majority in Iran, so I have privilege in Iran, that we don't just center, you know, like the Persian folks in Iran, but that everyone is brought with us. Then I would feel, you know, okay, we've done it. We've built something. We've found those connective tissues and threads that will prevent, you know, the regime or bad actors from sliding their way through. But at the moment, we're quite away from that. There's a lot of amazing activists and dissidents in Iran working very hard and putting their lives on the risk. But yeah, we're some way away from that level of united front.
Wow, I wish this for all of us in all of our countries. Thank you so much for coming today and sharing all your experience and perspective and the ideas of solidarity and uniting. Thank you, everyone who found time during lunch to join us for this talk. And I hope to stay in touch, and I'll connect you with Jan. And yeah, would it be okay if we share your presentation? Cool. Okay, thank you, and have a great day.